When Britten and Peers were in the United States between 1939 and 1942, Britten still had quite a lot of contact with the UK, and he was sent a copy of The Listener. And in The Listener, he read an article by E.M. Forster, the great critic and novelist, about George Crabbe, the poet and the man. George Crabbe was a poet from Aldeburgh. He was actually born in what used to be part of Slaughton, which now no longer exists. And this captured Britten's imagination. He'd written a long narrative poem called The Borough. It was published in 1810. And The Borough was very much about Aldeburgh. And it focused on the characters, the lives of the characters, particularly the poor of the borough. And one particular character entranced Britten's imagination. It was a character called Peter Grimes. And he believed that this would make a great basis for an opera. Now, as luck would have it, he'd received a commission from the great Russian-born American conductor Serge Koussevitzky to compose an opera. But he believed that he couldn't compose it in the United States. He had to go back to Suffolk to do that. He and Peers had wanted to return to the UK anyway, so in 1942 they travelled across the Atlantic, rather a perilous journey, and when they settled here in Suffolk, they decided to begin work on adapting Peter Grimes. During the journey, they'd occupied their time by making plans for the opera. In fact, we have in the archive a series of plans, a series of scenarios written out by Britten and Peers. And very helpfully, it's written on starline paper. They travelled on a ship called the Axel Johnson. Britten and Peers worked on a scenario for quite some time. They also worked on a libretto. Britten decided he wouldn't write a note of music until the words were completely as he wanted them. He engaged a gentleman called Montague Slater, with whom he'd worked at the Left Theatre in the 1930s as the librettist. And he and Slater worked on the libretto quite rigorously. Again, in the collection, we have quite a number of typescript drafts of the libretto, all annotated by people like Britten, Peers, the producer, Eric Crozier, just getting the words entirely as they wanted. A case in point is the very well-known Great Bear and Pleiades aria that Grimes sings when he comes into the pub during the storm and stops everyone in their tracks by this wonderfully poetic and rather weird set of words that he starts singing about the constellation. Well, in the original version of this, Montague Slater had various similes and metaphors that weren't quite right as far as Britten was concerned. For example, in one of these, he talks about, "But if the horoscopes are bewildering like a school playground full of noisy children." Well, Britten read this and he felt that perhaps that wouldn't be quite right. A fisherman would use a different kind of simile, so that quite famously became,
"But if the horoscopes bewildering like a flashing turmoil of a shoal of headache."
So this was Britten more or less putting himself into the imagination of Peter Grimes, the character. In the collection, we also have a very important item. It's the collected works of George Crabbe, Crabbe's poetical works, which was first published in 1851. And this was purchased while Britten and Peers were still in the United States. In fact, we have very handily an inscription from Peter Peers himself. He said, "I bought this book at a Los Angeles bookseller in 1941. And from this, we started work on the plans for making an opera out of Peter Grimes." He actually altered that slightly. That was originally written in 1978. In 1982, he remembered possibly it was San Diego, not Los Angeles, that he bought it. But anyway, this one rather handsome volume contains the poem The Borough, and this pretty much is the genesis of the work Peter Grimes. And rather interestingly too, Peers says that we made an opera out of Peter Grimes, showing it was very much a collaborative effort. I have to confess, as someone who works on conservation of books, I'd love to have seen actually more annotations in this volume than there are in fact, but Britten very lightly annotated it, and he drew line markings in the margins to direct himself to key moments in the poem that he wanted to focus on and adapt into the finished opera. By the beginning of 1944, he was ready to start work on the music, and in fact he worked for quite some time on the music. It was probably the longest period that he's ever actually worked on a score. Usually Britten gave himself just a matter of months, but in this instance he had quite a bit longer. Now, the opera itself was performed by Sadler's Wells Opera Company. It was the first work that the company performed with the advent of peace in Europe, and it was premiered on the 7th of June 1945. There was a little bit of resistance from both the company and from various other people at the time. Of course, with the advent of peace in Europe, People wanted to see celebratory things on stage. Very few people probably wanted to see an opera about a sadistic fisherman who loses his mind. So there was a little bit of resistance, but it wasn't long before both the critics and certainly the audience recognised that this was an extraordinary piece. And Peter Grimes became a wonderful success. It launched Britten's career in a way that even he possibly couldn't have imagined. And it really was the start of a new era in opera in English.